Okay, I'm back with more stress for you. That's what we all need this spring. And so, in the first part of this handout, we saw some basic properties of what stress is like in different languages, as well as the fact that in some languages there is no stress at all. And in the next few sections, we're going to go through a formal theory, a formal theory from the Hayes textbook of how stress works. And he's going to treat it as what we saw in the previous sections was that stress is a property of syllables, and it tends to be something that holds of syllables in terms of their configuration with regard to other syllables, right? It's something that holds over sequences of syllables in a often predictable or alternating way, but it can also be underlyingly specified in some languages. And so, what Hayes is going to do is treat stress as a feature, just like all the other features that we've seen, at least in the first semester. Features got a little bit more complicated this semester, obviously. But the basic idea is stress is a feature on vowels or on syllables. I guess here it's on syllables that can be either plus or minus. And that's basically what stress is going to be. How are we going to assign stress? Because it's in these rhythmic configurations with regard to the number of other syllables in a word. Well, it's going to be a feature that's assigned by a phonological algorithm, some kind of a phonological rule that counts syllables. That's the basic idea here. So let me preface all of this by saying that this is clearly the wrong theory of stress. Bruce Hayes doesn't believe that this is the right theory of stress, and neither does anybody else. But what this theory has going for it is that A, it's extremely simple. And it builds off of the technology that we already have in phonology, namely feature theory. We know how features and rules work. And it captures enough of the patterns that we see in the languages of the world to be useful, to bring those patterns to the fore and allow us to appreciate some things about how different kinds of stress patterns work. And it also makes clear in the end exactly what we're not getting about stress systems by treating it as a feature. We'll get there eventually, but we're not going to go with the full on true theory of stress in this class because it's just too much. It's very, very complicated and could really be a semester long class in and of itself. This theory is going to be close enough to be useful and to highlight interesting and important properties of stress systems around the world. So we'll start with the kind of easy stuff here, and then eventually we'll get into more complicated patterns. Here's a simple stress pattern, or actually maybe I should start with example 0, a language with no stress where there is no plus or minus stress feature. That's the simplest possible system. Amongst languages that do have stress, the simplest one would be a single stress per word, where the location of that stress is completely predictable. Right? And so here's Hayes' textbook analysis of Polish. And in Polish, stress is completely predictable, non-contrastive, fixed, and it's fixed on the second to last syllable in the world, which is, second to last syllable in the word, which is referred to as penultimate stress. So there's this jargon around stress where the second to last is referred to as penultimate. The one before that is anti-penultimate. If you're being very, very jargony, you can refer to the fourth from last as the anti-penultimate, although people don't do that so much. This all suggests that the last syllable in the word should probably be referred to as ultimate, but it isn't. It's referred to as final in this jargon. Don't exactly know why. In any case, Polish has predictable penultimate stress. Here's an example using morphological alternations, where the word for television in Polish is telewizor. You put a suffix on it that means little tv, so this is a diminutive suffix, and the stress stays penultimate in the word, which means it has to shift to another syllable, to the final syllable of the morpheme telewizor, and it becomes telewizorek. You put another diminutive on it, so this is a double diminutive, it's a little itsy bitsy tiny TV, and again, the stress shifts with regard to the morpheme telewizor, but remains on the second to last syllable of the entire word, telewizoreczek. So this is showing us that no matter what you do with morphemes and segments and whatever else, Polish stress is always fixed on the second to last syllable of the word. And so here's the sort of first part of the analysis, and then we're going to see a small problem which actually leads to a big and important revision to how this theory works. Here's the first attempt. Uh, a syllable becomes plus stress when it is in this location preceding another syllable which itself precedes the word boundary. In other words, end of the word, last syllable, target area, the one before the last syllable, those syllables are predictably stressed. Assign stress to the second last syllable in the word. This works for what we've seen here so far. We're going to need to use the syllabification algorithm that we learned in the first unit of this semester. And remember how that works. You pick out all of the plus syllabic elements. In these Polish words that we're looking at, I think these are all going to be vowels. So every vowel is the head of a syllable. Project a syllable from each vowel. E, I, O. Now parse the consonants into the syllables. This is the part that's sort of complicated and is going to be crucially important later in the stress unit here. The way we did that syllabification algorithm is to find consonants and first try to attach them into onsets. Right? So if there's a following vowel that they can be parsed into the same syllable as a possible word beginning, then do so. And so in Polish, t, l, v, z, these are all possible word beginnings. Therefore, they're also possible syllable onsets. Parse these into the syllable. If there's any consonants left over, then parse them into the coda, if it's possible to do so. Here, there's only one consonant left over, the word final r, and so we're going to parse that into the preceding syllable as a coda. We know we can do that because r is a possible word ending. This is the syllable structure we end up with. Not going to be super important in Polish, but it will be in other languages. The point here is just that now we have the word completely parsed into syllables. We had an underlying form here with no syllables in it. We build syllables out of that underlying form according to the syllabification algorithm. We default assign stresslessness minus stress to every syllable. Now the stress algorithm happens. We need to say that syllables are predictably plus stress if they are in this position preceding the final syllable in a word. So applied to the televisor example, we're going to add stress to this particular position, and we'll get out televisor with a stressed V syllable. Similarly, we put some suffixes on the end here. The word boundary goes rightwards, and so the stress follows it because it's always picking out the second to last syllable in the word. So far, so good. Pretty simple, pretty easy. There's one minor problem here, which is that Polish also has one-syllable words, so words like sen and stach, and this stress rule can't see those words, right? Because the stress rule is saying, hey, scan every word and find the final syllable and then put stress on the syllable before it. If there's only one syllable in a word, then there's never going to be any context for this rule to stress a syllable, and therefore we would predict that presumably one syllable words should just be unstressed. That's not true in Polish. And this is, even though it seems like a relatively trivial and straightforward problem, it actually is indicative of a more general property of stress, which is unlike some of the other kinds of rules we've looked at in this class, they often have multiple forms of the same rule. And those forms take the to have the structure of here's the default rule for assigning stress, but if you can't assign stress in that way, then try this other way. Right? And that's exactly what's going on here with the final version of the Polish stress rule from the Hayes text. He's added this parenthesis notation, right? And what this is saying is that that final element is optional. And the particular way that we're going to need to implement this, because again, we're trying to use an algorithm that can just operate automatically. The way this is going to work in Polish is that for these optional elements, first try to apply the rule with the element there. Right? In televisor, if you do have a position that's to the left of the final syllable in the word, then do that. But if that fails, like in sen or stach, then get rid of this element and just stress whatever's left over. So This is encoding a fairly simple property in Polish, but it's going to get a little bit more complicated later. What does this parenthesis notation mean? Well, Hayes refers to these as expansions, and the idea is that putting a parenthesis like that in the rule defines an order of different possible rule applications, with the most complicated ones first. So first try this expansion, the maximal expansion that has everything in it. And if that doesn't work, that is, if there is no penultimate syllable, then try the simpler one, which has that optional parenthesized element absent. Right? So this is going to work well for Polish stress. It will say stress the penultimate syllable if there is one, otherwise stress the final syllable, or in this case, the only syllable in the word. So this is working well for Polish, but now we're going to need a way of reining in this formalism. So this should sound familiar from everything else we've done in phonology. We make up a theory that describes something simple. We see the ways in which it falls short. We add some kind of a special formal device, in this case the parenthesis notation, to try to deal with that situation. And now we need to figure out a way to constrain the extra complications we just put in. And so here's Hayes's solution for how we're going to use these parenthesis rules. We're going to try the longest first. Right? So if a stress rule includes an expression in parentheses, the longest expansions must be tried first. In this case, that's just going to be the one with the element first. So here, when a stress rule is applied under some expansion, all remaining expansions are skipped. Right? So in televisor, we succeeded in applying the biggest expansion here, so we don't want to then go on to try this one and add a second stress on the last syllable. To avoid that, we use this blocking convention. And then finally, there's completeness. If a stress rule can't apply in a longer expansion, then the longest available remaining expansion must be tried next. Now, in this case, there's not such a series of expansions. There's just 1, 2. But we'll see some other cases in a moment where there are more than 2 possibilities, and these conventions are governing the order in which they must be applied and what happens once you're done. So this is going to be relevant for alternating stress systems. Here is Warau, which is going to be fairly similar to the Maranunku example that we saw earlier in this handout. And what you can see in Warau is that you have fixed alternating predictable stress on every other syllable. And here it seems to be starting from the right edge of the word. And so it'll be the second from last, fourth from last, sixth from last, eighth from last, so on and so forth, that are stressed here. Whereas if you have leftover syllables at the beginning of the word, those just stay unstressed. So here are some my attempts to pronounce some of these data points. Here's an 8-syllable word, yapuruki tanehase. That's an even syllable count, so we're just getting 4 perfect sequences of 2 syllables, stressed, unstressed. In odd syllable count words, we end up with a stranded one at the beginning of the word here. So for the 5-syllable word, he finished it, we get yuwaranae. And for a 9-syllable one, we get enahoroa hakutai. Sorry, I messed that one up. Enahoroa hakutai. So this is what we're seeing. We're also seeing here a difference between primary stress, which is this apostrophe type high diacritic, and secondary stress, which is this lower diacritic here. So what we're going to need in Warau is at least a primary stress rule and a secondary stress rule. And then we're also going to need iterating rule application, right? This rule about secondary stress in particular, it keeps getting assigned as many times as you can throughout the entire word. So that rule that assigns those stresses, that's going to have to operate again and again and again until it can't anymore. That's referred to as iterating rule application. So let's check an example of how this works. Primary stress here in Warau is going to be more or less just like Polish. It's penultimate. It has stress on the second to last syllable. And that's the primary stress, which we'll refer to as plus main and plus stress. So here, being a primary versus secondary stress is a phonological feature, just like being stressed or unstressed is. And this is going to work just like Polish, where we put the final syllable in parentheses to indicate that in case there is no second to last syllable, that is for one syllable words, then put the stress on the only syllable available. Now, the secondary stress rule is marked here as iterative, which means that you keep on applying it as many times as you can throughout the word. Right? This one says that a syllable is predictably stressed if it's in this position where it precedes a syllable which itself precedes a syllable that's stressed. Right? Whether that's primary or secondary doesn't matter. If there's another syllable 2 slots forward that's stressed, then stress this syllable too. How is this going to work in practice? Here's the underlying form. This is I think the 9-syllable one. We're going to use the exact same algorithm to put consonants and vowels into syllables. And here in Warao, it looks like they basically only have onsets consonants. So this is pretty straightforward and simple. We're going to mark the main stress, the primary stress, according to this rule, trying the longest expansion first, which is this one. Indeed, we find a penultimate stress here. And so we're going to add on the primary stress here. This, I believe, is a typo. That should be plus main plus stress, as it is down here, and not minus main plus stress. That's, I think, a mistake. Now we're going to start the secondary stress rule. And crucially, we have to start this rule from the end of the word going backwards. If we start it from the other direction, it's going to fail more or less completely. So this is interesting. It's showing us that there's some directionality in how these rules have to be applied in order to work. What are we going to do here? Well, we're looking for this context where you have a target syllable that's followed by another syllable, and that one is followed by a stressed syllable. Do we find that in this particular word? We do. We find this syllable ha, which is followed by another syllable ku, and that's followed by another syllable ta that's marked plus stress. So what are we going to do? We're going to mark it plus stress. And this one will be marked minus main because it's a secondary stress rule. So good. So we now have a secondary stress. Because this is an iterative rule, it means, well, better go back and try it again. What do we find now? Hey, here's a syllable ro followed by another syllable a, which itself is followed by a stressed syllable ha. That's the one we just created. Let's add another one in here, plus stress. Keep going. Here's the third iteration. Now we've got 3 secondary stresses and a primary stress. Here's the last iteration here. We now have stresses on all of these syllables. Let's try to apply the rule again. Well, we do find this context with a syllable a that's followed by another syllable na that's stressed, but the rule would be targeting the syllable before a. That doesn't exist, so on the 4th iteration of the secondary stress rule, it fails and we're done. So now we've derived the stress pattern in this 9-syllable word. The algorithm terminates and everybody's happy. So this is the way we deal with more complicated alternating stress patterns within this Hayes framework. We have to use iterating rules and we have to use them in a particular direction. So far so good. We're doing a good job dealing with fixed stress, with alternating stress, with languages that just don't have stress. This theory gets at all of that so far because we're defining stress as a feature. So it's just like any other feature, like continuancy or nasality or voicing. But we've already seen there's actually some aspects of these rules that make this kind of look not a lot like other features. And so here are some ways that stress is not really like a feature. Even in this framework, we're running into this. First of all, we saw this parenthesis notation, which suggests that there's like a whole bunch of different ways in which you might try to apply stress rules. And if this one fails, then try this other one. We'll see even more elaborate examples of that shortly. And other features don't usually work that way. And here's some other aspects or different ways of looking at these properties of stress that are kind of funny from a phonological perspective. So other features don't usually shift from segment to segment based on difference from the word edge, right? So we saw this in Polish where changing the location of the word edge by adding suffixes makes stress shift all over the place. The same thing is true in English, right? So here's three related words morphologically: origin. Uh, Now put a suffix on, and all of a sudden the stress changes to the next syllable, original. And sorry, there's a missing tab here. There should be a space between these two words. Um, put a two syllable, put another suffix on, and now all of a sudden it shifts again, originality. So we're changing the location of the word boundary, and the stress is shifting in these English words, just as it did in Polish. Right? Photograph versus photographer, it's not photographer, versus photographic, it's not photographic. And so as we change the location of morpheme and word boundaries, we're shifting the location of this feature from position to position within the word. That's not how continuancy or nasality or voicing usually works, at least not in any language that we've seen in this class. So that's a little bit funny. Here's another interesting one. This is the so-called rhythm rule in Germanic languages, including English, where when you have a primary and secondary stress in a word, and you put that word next to another word, you sometimes get a reorganization of the primary and secondary stresses. And so this is a case of a feature acting at long distances across other instances of that feature. What do I mean by that? Well, so the standard pronunciation of this state in the United States is Mississippi, with secondary stress on the first syllable and primary stress on the penult, Mississippi. But when you put another word after it in some kind of a compound that has primary stress on its first syllable, like legislators, you end up having the primary stress, which used to be penultimate here, shifting back to the first syllable. And so what you get out here in general is Mississippi legislators, right, where that primary stress has shifted from this syllable onto this syllable under the presence of a primary stress in the next word, right? So if we're treating this as a feature, we're going to have some kind of a change in the feature of this syllable that's brought on by this syllable across an intervening instance of the feature plus stress that's in between the two here. And this is exactly the kind of thing that even in autosegmental theory, where you do get long distance phonological dependencies, they're not supposed to hold across intervening instances of the feature. So this is pretty unusual. This makes stress look, again, not just like any other phonological feature. And then all of these properties that we looked at earlier, culminativity, hierarchy, alternation, these are all also pretty different from other features that we've looked at in here. So most languages don't require, say, every content word to have at least one plus value of other features, except maybe syllabic. That could be true, that every content word has to have at least one syllable in it. But beyond that, we don't find languages where every word has to have at least one stop in it, or every word has to have at least one labial in it. Yet we find across many languages, over and over again, requirements that every content word has at least one plus stress in it. So that is, again, ways in which stress doesn't exactly look like other features. Other common things we've been using to look at other features in the last 2 semesters are also things that don't hold for stress. So there is no process anybody knows of stress assimilation, for instance. We find lots of assimilatory rules. We've spent most of the last 2 semesters looking at assimilation rules. There is no such thing as stress assimilation, as far as we can figure out. Now, this kind of a thing where you get primary stress here repelling a primary stress here, that could be thought of as stress dissimilation, although it's not the only way you could think of it. But that said, most of the rules we've seen for other features are assimilation rules, and stress just doesn't seem to have one. And then the final thing here is more conceptual, and it's really the sort of governing intuition about why we don't really think that stress is actually a feature the way we're going to treat it here. And that's because features alone can't really express the relativity of stress, right? So it's rhythmicity, the fact that it tends to be equally spaced over sequences of intervals. You can write that into a rule with brute force, but there's nothing about this feature rule framework that says that stress ought to behave that way. And that's the same is true for hierarchical relationships. There's nothing in our rule formalism so far that says that something that's stressed at the syllable level, something that's stressed at the phrase level also has to be stressed at the word level and the syllable level. We just don't have that in our formalism. And so these are all problems with stress and with treating stress as a feature. And so for these and some other reasons, in real contemporary phonology, just about nobody thinks that stress is actually a binary feature. That said, we're going to press on and look at some more properties of stress systems using this feature notation because it's close enough to get us to the interesting properties without messing things up too badly. So I'll split this part out into yet another lecture.